Tonight, at the most exclusive charity gala in New York City, a mafia boss stands on the red carpet with his mistress on his arm, while the wife he calls a nobody waits in the shadows. He has humiliated her, replaced her, and told her she is nothing without him. What Luca Moretti doesn't know is that the quiet woman he married is secretly the sole heir to a $90 billion global dynasty. And tonight, she is done waiting. If you want to find out how a mafia boss loses everything he built in a single night, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And follow along to the very end. The city never really went quiet. That was something Elena had learned in the 4 years since she'd moved into the Moretti penthouse on the 43rd floor of a glass tower overlooking the East River. Even at 2 in the morning, Manhattan breathed. Cab horns, distant sirens, the low mechanical hum of a city that ran on ambition and wouldn't apologize for it. She used to find it comforting. Now it just reminded her that the world outside kept moving while she stood perfectly still inside these walls, invisible and irrelevant, a woman-shaped decoration in a life that had never really belonged to her. She was sitting at the kitchen island when Luca came home. She heard him before she saw him. The elevator chime, the heavy drag of the penthouse door, the particular way his shoes hit the marble floor when he'd been drinking. Not stumbling drunk. Luca Moretti never stumbled, but there was a looseness to his step when he'd had 3 or 4 glasses of scotch, a kind of casual arrogance that softened the sharp edges he carried everywhere else. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he stopped noticing. "You're still up," he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't warmth. It was just an observation, the same way you'd note that the refrigerator was still running. "I made dinner," Elena said. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. "It's in the oven. It'll be cold now." Luca pulled at his tie, loosening the knot with 2 practiced fingers. He was, by any objective measure, a beautiful man. Broad through the shoulders, jaw cut sharp enough to draw blood, dark eyes that could communicate threat or charm with a single adjustment of focus. He wore his money the way men like him always did. Not flashily, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd never once had to check a price tag. The suit he had on tonight was charcoal Italian wool. The watch on his wrist was worth more than most people's cars. "I ate with the Falcones," he said, moving to the bar cart near the window and pouring 2 fingers of scotch without offering her any. He never offered any more. That had stopped around the 18-month mark, somewhere between the first time he'd introduced Vivian Cross as his associate and the night he'd told Elena in front of 3 of his lieutenants that she had the social presence of a librarian. She had in fact been a librarian. For 2 years, before she'd met him. She'd loved it. "The Falcones," she said. "On a Tuesday. Vincent's got a deal moving. He wanted my input." Luca swirled his glass and stared out at the river. "There's an event Friday night, the Future Horizons Gala. I need you to clear the evening." Elena looked at him. "You want me to come?" He didn't look at her. "I didn't say that. I said clear the evening. I need the town car in Petrov for the night. You can take a cab wherever you're going." She held very still. It was a skill she'd developed over the last 2 years, this ability to absorb something sharp without flinching. You got good at it when you practiced enough. "I volunteer at the Literacy Center on Fridays," she said, "then reschedule." "Luca." "Elena." He turned then, and his eyes were flat in the way they got when he was done having a conversation. "I'm not asking you to move a mountain. I'm asking you to reschedule one evening at a place where you hand out picture books to adults who can't read. I think the car being available is the more pressing concern." She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was very clean and very quiet, and the city outside pulsed its indifferent pulse. "Fine," she said. "The car is yours." He nodded once, finished his scotch, and walked toward the bedroom without another word. He didn't ask about her day. He didn't ask about anything. The door clicked shut, and Elena sat alone in the kitchen with the cold dinner still in the oven and the sound of the city coming through the glass like a frequency she couldn't quite tune out. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single text to a number saved under the name M. Vale, her cousin Marcus, the only person in the world who knew every piece of the truth about who she was. And the text read, "Friday. I think Friday." His response came back in under a minute. "I'll make the call." She set the phone face down on the marble counter and stared at the window and let herself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what she'd been carrying for 4 years. It was considerable. It pressed on the sternum, that kind of weight. It made breathing feel like work. Then she put it down. Not forever. Just for tonight. She was good at that too. The story of Elena Vale began, as most stories about quiet women do, in a place that had nothing to do with quiet. Her father, Magnus Vale, had built his empire the way engineers build bridges, with obsessive precision, an absolute intolerance for structural weakness, and a willingness to work through conditions that sent everyone else home. He'd started with a single logistics company in Singapore when he was 26, leveraged it into a regional shipping network, then a global one, then diversified into energy infrastructure, pharmaceutical distribution, and technology investment over the following 3 decades, until Vale Global Holdings was a name that made finance ministers return calls on weekends. $90 billion. That was the number the financial press used. Elena thought it was probably a little low. Magnus had one child, Elena. Her mother, a French architect named Celeste, had died when Elena was 9. An aneurysm, fast and without warning, the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself and leaves no room for preparation. Magnus had mourned in the way powerful men mourn, which is to say, privately and completely. And then he had redirected every atom of his formidable focus onto his daughter. He wanted her prepared, not sheltered, prepared. There was a difference, and Magnus Vale understood it precisely. Elena had grown up moving between Singapore, London, Geneva, and New York, educated at institutions that didn't advertise themselves, trained in languages and finance and negotiation, and the particular kind of stillness that executives cultivate when they want a room to come to them, rather than the other way around. She had also, to her father's occasional bewilderment, developed a genuine love of ordinary things. Libraries, community gardens, the specific satisfaction of a meal cooked from scratch on a Tuesday with no agenda. Magnus had never entirely understood it, but he'd respected it. He respected most things about his daughter, even the ones that confused him. When she was 24, Elena had made a request that he'd sat with for 3 full days before answering. She wanted to live anonymously for a while, to take a position under her mother's maiden name, not Vale, to see what the world looked like when it didn't know who she was, to find out if she could connect with people, with a person, specifically, a partner, without her net worth doing the work for her. Magnus had said yes on the condition that Marcus, his nephew, and Elena's closest cousin maintain contact, and that a small security detail operate at a distance she would never have to acknowledge. Elena had agreed. She'd moved to New York. She'd taken the library position. She'd lived simply and completely, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she loved it. She'd met Luca Moretti at a fundraising dinner 8 months in. He was charismatic in the concentrated, directed way of men who understood exactly what they were doing with their charm. He'd focused on her the way a spotlight focuses. Total illumination, a little blinding, the kind of attention that makes you feel both seen and exposed. He hadn't known who she was. That had been, in the beginning, the whole point. She told herself she was being careful. She'd done research, not on his finances, but on him, the human being, the way he treated people in unguarded moments. He'd seemed decent then. Rough around the edges in ways she'd found appealing rather than alarming. He was building something, she'd thought. He was a man with ambition and drive and a complicated past who was trying to construct something lasting. She'd been wrong. Not about what he was building, about what he was willing to tear down in the process. She found out about the criminal organization slowly, the way you find out about most things that are hiding in plain sight. A name mentioned and then carefully unmentioned. An associate with eyes that had seen things they didn't want to discuss. A meeting canceled with no explanation that she later learned had involved a federal surveillance team. Luca was not a man who'd inherited his position in the Moretti organization. He'd earned it in ways that left no paper trail and considerable human wreckage. By the time she understood the full shape of what he was, she was already in love, or something that had felt like love at the time. She was honest enough with herself now, sitting in this clean kitchen in this glass tower, to acknowledge that what she'd fallen for might have been the idea of him more than the reality. The reality had taken longer to show itself. They married 18 months after they met. Luca had proposed at a private dinner. No audience, no fanfare, which she'd read as sincerity and which she now understood was simply efficiency. He hadn't wanted the complication of a public spectacle before he knew she'd say yes. The ring was extraordinary. The prenuptial agreement arrived 3 days later, delivered by his attorney with an apologetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. Elena had read every word of it. She'd even added a clause that his attorney had skimmed past, assuming it was a minor request about undisclosed assets. It wasn't minor, but she hadn't explained that, and Luca had signed without asking. That was the first time she'd understood that he underestimated her, not the last. The first year of their marriage had been something, not exactly happy, but charged. The kind of early relationship energy that can be mistaken for love because it produces the same physiological symptoms. Luca had been attentive in the way powerful men are attentive when they're still trying to possess something. He'd shown her off selectively, brought her to dinners where she was expected to be decorative and quiet, and she'd played the role without complaint because she'd still been watching, still evaluating, still hoping the better version of him she'd glimpsed in the early months would reassert itself. It didn't. Instead, Vivian Cross appeared. Vivian was 31, the daughter of a politically connected family from Connecticut, and she had the particular kind of polished beauty that required maintenance the way a race car requires maintenance, constant, expensive, and specialized. She moved in Luca's world effortlessly because she'd been born adjacent to it, had grown up understanding the grammar of power and money and how to position yourself within it. She laughed at the right moments. She wore the right things. She never looked uncertain. Elena had watched Vivian appear in their social orbit with the neutral attention of someone who already knows the ending of a story and is simply watching it unfold. She was not naive. She understood what Vivian was. She even understood, on some structural level, why Luca was drawn to her. Vivian was a reflection of what he wanted to see himself as, a partner who matched the image he was building, who amplified his status rather than complicating it. What Elena had not fully anticipated was how quickly he'd stop pretending. It happened at the Hargrove Foundation dinner in November of their second year. Elena had worn a simple dark dress, nothing spectacular, because she hadn't felt spectacular that week, and she'd never seen the point of performing emotions she wasn't having. Luca had picked her up and looked at her and said, in a voice with no cruelty in it, which somehow made it worse, "You could have made more of an effort," and then looked away. She'd sat through 4 hours of that dinner watching him light up for Vivian across the table with a warmth he hadn't directed at Elena in months. She'd eaten the food and drunk the water and made conversation with the people around her and felt, somewhere in her sternum, a door closing. Not dramatically, not with shattering or tears, just the quiet mechanical click of something being finalized. After that, she'd begun to prepare. She didn't tell anyone she was leaving. That was important. Luca had informants everywhere, people who reported on everyone close to him out of loyalty or fear or both. And Elena had learned early in the marriage that privacy required patience and misdirection. You didn't announce your intentions. You built toward them incrementally, in pieces small enough to be individually meaningless. She'd reached out to Marcus 6 months ago. He'd been waiting. He'd been managing her interests with an attorney named Diane Chu, who was the most formidable contract lawyer Elena had ever met, for the entirety of her marriage, and when Elena finally said the word, the apparatus was ready. The clause in the prenuptial agreement was airtight. Luca had signed away any claim to undisclosed family assets, defined as any inheritance, family trust, or corporate interest not explicitly listed at the time of signing. Elena's identity as Elena Vale, her father's sole heir, beneficiary of a $90 billion estate held in trust and in corporate structure, had not been disclosed. Luca had signed the document without knowing what he was waiving. His attorney, who'd written the agreement and reviewed the added clause, had assumed it was protecting Elena from a hypothetical future windfall. He hadn't thought to ask what it was actually protecting. Luca would get nothing. The apartment, divided by standard New York law. Some of the jointly held accounts. Nothing that touched the Vale estate. Elena had explained all of this to Marcus on a phone call 3 months ago. He'd listened and then said, "Dad wants to know if you're okay." She'd thought about that for a moment. "Tell him I will be. He wants you home." "I know." She'd looked around the penthouse, the expensive furniture she'd had no hand in choosing, the art on the walls that Luca had bought as investments, rather than because he loved it. The view that was beautiful in the way that things purchased to be beautiful always were. Tell him soon. Thursday came and went. Elena went to the literacy center on Thursday evening, not Friday. She'd rescheduled without telling Luca, not because he would have cared, but because it felt like reclaiming a small square of her own life. She worked with a group of adults ranging in age from 22 to 67, people who were learning to read for the first time or recovering literacy after accidents or illness, and she sat with them for 3 hours and felt, in that specific way she only felt here, that she was doing something real. There was a man named Darnell who was 54 and learning to read after a lifetime of working jobs that hadn't required it. He had enormous hands and a careful dignity, and he held the practice sheets with total concentration. He'd gotten through a full paragraph that night without stopping. When he reached the end, he looked up at Elena with something in his face she couldn't name exactly. It wasn't pride. It was more personal than pride. And she'd said, "That's the whole thing, Darnell. You read the whole thing." He'd nodded slowly and looked back at the page like he needed to verify it. "I did," he said. "Yeah, I did." She'd driven home after that and sat in the parking garage for 10 minutes before going up, letting the feeling of it settle into her. She wanted to carry that with her, the specific weight of something that mattered, not because it was impressive, but because it was true. Upstairs, the penthouse was empty. Luca was out. Vivian's perfume was faint but present in the entryway, which meant she'd been here. Elena walked through the apartment and didn't let herself think about it, changed into clothes she could sleep in, and called her father. Magnus Vale answered on the second ring. He was 81 years old and in better health than men 20 years younger. His voice was like a piece of old timber, dense and dry with a grain running through it. "Elena," he said. "Hi, Dad." "Marcus told me." "Friday." "Friday," she confirmed. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Her father had never been a man who filled silences just to fill them. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I've been afraid for 2 years. I think I'm done being afraid." "Good." Another pause. "You have the necklace?" The necklace. The sapphire piece that had been her mother's, commissioned by Magnus for Celeste on their 10th anniversary. A single deep blue stone surrounded by an asymmetric arrangement of smaller diamonds, set in platinum, worth somewhere in the region of $3 million, and priceless in the way that cannot be expressed numerically. It was kept in a vault in the Vale offices on Park Avenue. Elena had asked for it 3 weeks ago. "I have it," she said. "Your mother wore it in the photograph the year you were born," Magnus said. "You know the one." "I know the one." Elena closed her eyes. She knew the one. Her mother sitting in a garden somewhere in the south of France, laughing at something behind the camera, the necklace catching the light. Elena had been 3 months old. Celeste had been 32. She'd had 7 more years. "Good," her father said again. "Let them see you." Friday arrived the way significant days always do, without announcement, looking initially like any other morning. Elena woke before Luca, which was normal. She made coffee and stood at the window with it and watched the city begin its day. The river was gray-green in the early light, moving with its customary indifference. A container ship was making its slow way south. Luca came out of the bedroom at 8, dressed already, moving with the contained energy of a man who had plans. He poured coffee without acknowledging her and stood at the counter scrolling through his phone. "The car's ready," Elena said. He looked up briefly. "Good. What time do you need Petrov?" 6. "We're walking the carpet at 7:30. He went back to his phone. He was wearing a gray suit today, meeting clothes, the kind of day where he'd be establishing territory, and he dressed accordingly. "Don't wait up." She nodded. He left. She stood in the kitchen after the elevator door closed and let the quiet settle for a moment. 4 years. She'd been standing in various versions of this kitchen for 4 years, watching him leave, existing in the spaces between his attention. She'd arrived in this marriage with hope that had taken a long time to die, and now here she was on the other side of it, and the surprising thing, the thing she hadn't quite expected, was how clean it felt. Not painless. Clean. She had things to do. She called the number for Meridian Event Services, the company Marcus had contracted. We're confirmed for 7, said the woman on the line. I'll be ready at 6:30, Elena said. The gown is at the address you provided. The car will be a black Meridian sedan. Your cousin will be there. Good. She set the phone down and went to start the day. She spent the morning at the Vale offices on Park Avenue, the branch office, not the headquarters, a set of floors that operated quietly and efficiently, and that Luca had never once thought to ask about. Diane Chu was there with a file folder that contained everything Elena needed to know about the next 48 hours. They sat at a table and went through it methodically. The agreement is ironclad, Diane said. She was a small woman in her 40s with an economy of movement and a voice that functioned like a scalpel. I've had 2 outside firms review the clause, and it holds. He signed it. His attorney signed off. Under New York law, undisclosed assets at the time of signing are explicitly excluded. There's no argument. He'll try to make one, Elena said. He'll fail. Diana allowed herself a small, precise smile. Luca Moretti is very good at many things, Elena. Asset division litigation isn't one of them. What about the divorce filing? It goes in Monday morning. We front-run the news cycle by about 6 hours based on the timeline from tonight. Diane paused. Are you certain about the public nature of this? Elena looked at her. He humiliated me publicly for 2 years. He called me a nobody in front of people whose names are in the newspaper. He brought his mistress to events where I was expected to appear as his wife, then excluded me to take her instead. She kept her voice level. Yes, I'm certain about the public nature of this. Diane nodded once. Then we're ready. Marcus was in the outer office, reading something on his phone, and he stood when she came out. He was 32, lean and dark-haired, with their grandfather's jaw and his own particular brand of restless intelligence. He'd been her closest friend for her entire life. He hugged her, which was not something he did often. How are you doing? He asked. Ask me tomorrow, Elena said. He pulled back and looked at her. You look terrifying, in the best possible way. She almost laughed. I haven't done anything yet. I know. That's what makes it terrifying. He held up his phone, showing her an image. The gown arrived. You need to see it. She looked at the screen. The dress was midnight blue, couture, structured at the shoulder and fluid through the body, the kind of garment that looked like it had opinions. She'd chosen it 3 weeks ago from a designer who worked exclusively by commission and who had, without being told the full context, clearly understood that this was a dress for a specific moment. That's the one, she said. And the necklace is in the vault. You can collect it at 5. She nodded, looked at her cousin for a moment. Thank you, she said, for everything. 4 years of... Stop. He shook his head. You don't thank me. That's not how this works. The afternoon was ordinary in ways that felt deliberately ironic. She stopped at the literacy center to drop off materials for the following week. She had lunch alone at a place she liked in the village, a small Italian restaurant where nobody knew who she was in either direction. Not the Mafia wife, not the heiress, just a woman at a corner table with pasta and a glass of water and a window looking out onto a street where the city did its relentless ordinary business. She thought about the past 4 years with the specific focus she'd been saving for this moment, now that it was actually here. Not the dramatic moments, the public snubs, the cold evenings, the Vivian Cross situation, the smaller ones. The Tuesday morning, Luca had said, half asleep, that she was wasting her life at that library, and she'd said she didn't think so, and he'd said that was the problem with her. She didn't know what waste looked like because she'd never had anything worth losing. She'd been making coffee at the time. She'd poured his cup, set it on the counter, and gone to work. She'd been carrying that one for 2 years, not because it was the worst thing he'd said, because it was the truest expression of how he saw her, as someone without scale, without heft, without significance, a woman moving through the margins of a life that belonged to someone else. Tonight, he was going to learn what he'd actually been standing next to. She finished her lunch and paid the check and walked back out into the city and felt for the first time in a long time the particular sensation of moving towards something rather than away from it. At 5 o'clock, Elena collected the necklace from the vault on the 32nd floor of the Vale offices. The case was matte black leather, small, and when she opened it, the stone caught the fluorescent light of the vault room and did something unexpected with it, turned it blue and deep and alive. She held the case for a moment and thought about her mother in that garden in France, laughing at something behind the camera. Okay, she said, to no one. To the necklace. To the years. Okay. At 6 o'clock, the Meridian sedan arrived at the Park Avenue address, not the penthouse. Marcus was already there. The gown was in a garment bag that a woman from the designer's team was holding with both hands. They set Elena up in a private room in the Vale offices. A car wouldn't do it. The gown required standing room. And when the designer's representative had finished, when the necklace was clasped at the back of Elena's neck and the midnight blue silk had settled into its proper architecture, the woman stepped back and looked at her with a professional silence that was the closest thing to speechlessness you could find in her industry. Marcus came in after the representative left. He stopped in the doorway. "Elena," he said. "Don't make it a thing," she said. "It's a thing," he said. "It's absolutely a thing." She turned to the mirror. She looked like her mother. She looked like herself. She looked like someone who knew something important that the rest of the room was about to learn. She looked like Elena Vale. The Future Horizons. Gala was the kind of event that existed at the precise intersection of charity and spectacle. It was held every year at the Grand Meridian Hotel in Midtown, 5 floors of glass and marble commissioned by an architect who had believed passionately in the moral authority of good light. And in its annual execution, it drew exactly the people it was designed to draw. The wealthy who wanted to be seen giving, the powerful who wanted to be associated with something clean, the well-connected who understood that the table you sat at in rooms like this was a statement that traveled. Luca arrived at 7:20 with Vivian on his arm and the easy command of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. He did, to be fair, do it well. He moved through the assembled cameras with the practiced grace of long experience, angling for the photographers he wanted, deflecting the ones he didn't, pausing in exactly the right moments to let Vivian's presence register. She was beautiful tonight. A red gown, hair up, the jewelry he'd bought her catching the light in the specific way expensive things catch light. She held his arm and smiled, and they looked like exactly what he wanted them to look like. He spoke briefly to Vincent Falcone near the entrance, shook hands with a city councilman he owned in 3 different ways, and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. He was at the top of his world tonight, and he knew it, and he had the relaxed posture of a man who had stopped worrying about things falling apart, because they never did for men like him. He wasn't thinking about Elena. He hadn't been thinking about Elena. She was somewhere on the other side of the city, presumably watching television, or at some library event, or otherwise occupying herself in the low-key, unambitious ways she always occupied herself. He'd used her town car. He'd told her he would. She'd agreed, and that had been the end of it. At 7:45, Luca was midway through a conversation with the president of a hedge fund when the room changed. It didn't change loudly. It changed the way pressure changes, the way you notice it in your ears before you understand what's happening. A shift in attention, a reorientation of bodies. Cameras that had been tracking him suddenly tracking something else, moving with the coordinated urgency of photojournalists who've identified the most significant presence in a room and are running toward it. Luca turned. The entrance to the gala floor was 30 feet away. The crowd between him and it was parting, not in response to any command, but in the instinctive way crowds part when they sense that the person coming through is someone they should make room for. A woman in midnight blue walked through the opening. Luca looked at her and felt a strange, displaced sensation, like a word he knew but couldn't place. The gown was extraordinary. The stone at her throat caught the light and threw it back as something altogether different. Her posture was the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at and had long since stopped caring whether anyone was watching. He knew the necklace. He'd seen photographs of it. Every person in the financial press who'd ever profiled Magnus Vale had published the photograph of Magnus's late wife wearing it. It was one of those objects that achieved a specific kind of visual fame, recognizable enough to function almost as a logo for an entire dynasty. The woman wearing it turned her head and found him across the room with an ease that told him she'd known exactly where he was standing. It was Elena. Luca's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Not Elena Moretti. Not the woman from his penthouse who scheduled time at literacy centers and wore simple dresses and had no social media presence and never seemed to want anything he was capable of giving. Not the woman he'd told 3 months ago that she had the personal magnetism of a substitute teacher. Not the woman he dismissed in 40 different ways over 4 years because she'd seemed constitutionally incapable of being dismissed. Her eyes met his across the room, and in that look, steady, clear, with not a single atom of performance in it, Luca Moretti felt for the first time in longer than he could remember the cold structural sensation of something going very wrong. The cameras reached her. The questions started. Someone in the press line said a name that Luca heard through the rising noise, a name that processed slowly, that took 3 full seconds to complete its passage through his understanding. Elena Vale. He heard it again, confirmed it. Felt his mind do the thing it did when faced with information that couldn't be integrated quickly, a kind of cognitive stutter, a refusal, and then coming through on the other side of the refusal, the beginning of understanding. $90 billion. Magnus Vale's daughter. His wife. Vivian said something beside him. He didn't hear it. He was looking at Elena, who was now answering a reporter's question with the composed, precise ease of someone who had been answering questions in rooms like this since before she could drive, and the specific quality of her composure, unhurried, unimpressed, completely at home, was telling him something about how thoroughly and completely he had misread every single day of the past 4 years. She hadn't been hiding from the world, she'd been waiting, and the wait, as of this moment, was over. Vivian's hand tightened on his arm. "Luca," she said. "Who is that?" He couldn't answer. He was still processing, still working through the implication of every conversation, every dismissal, every careless cruelty of the past 4 years, understanding now what they'd been directed at. Not a nobody, not a woman without scale or significance or anything worth losing. A woman who had let him believe all of that while she decided what to do with the information. "Luca." Vivian's voice had an edge now. "I asked you a question." He turned to look at her and saw, in the new light of what he was beginning to understand, how she registered what was in his face. "That's my wife," he said. The silence between them was 3 seconds long and contained something that felt structural, load-bearing, the kind of silence that holds things up right before they fall. And across the marble floor, in the light of 40 cameras, Elena Vale looked at her husband with the patient certainty of a woman who had been called nobody for the last time. And she smiled, not widely, not cruelly, but with the quiet, absolute composure of someone who had known exactly how this moment would arrive, had dressed for it, had carried it for 4 years without once putting it down, and was now, finally, ready to let it land. The cameras didn't stop. That was the thing about moments like this. They fed on themselves, one flash triggering the next. The crowd's attention a kind of fuel that burned hotter the more people turned toward it. Elena stood at the center of it with the particular stillness of someone who had learned, very young, that stillness was its own form of power. She answered the first question. Yes, she was Magnus Vale's daughter. Yes, she'd been in New York for several years. Yes, it was wonderful to be here tonight. And her voice carried the unhurried clarity of a woman who had rehearsed nothing because she didn't need to. Across the room, Luca hadn't moved. Vivian had. She'd taken a half step back from him, just enough to create distance, just enough to signal to anyone watching that she was reevaluating the geometry of the evening. Luca felt the withdrawal, the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatically, but in the body, in the chest. He set his champagne glass on the tray of a passing waiter with careful precision and started moving. He didn't run. Men like Luca Moretti didn't run across rooms at charity galas, not even on the worst nights of their lives. But he moved with the compressed urgency of someone who has identified a threat and is closing distance, weaving between clusters of guests with the single-mindedness of a man whose entire understanding of the last 4 years has just been detonated beneath him. He reached the edge of the press circle in under 90 seconds. The reporters hadn't noticed him yet. They were still aimed at Elena, still producing the questions that would fuel 3 news cycles, still not quite believing the story that had walked through the front door in a midnight blue gown and a necklace worth more than most buildings. Elena was in the middle of answering something about Vale Global Holdings when Luca stepped through the outer ring of the crowd and said her name. Elena. She turned her head. Found him. The look on her face didn't change. Luca, she said, the same tone she used when he came home late, and she acknowledged his presence from the kitchen. Neutral, containing nothing he could use. The cameras swung toward him. He registered them in his peripheral vision with the part of his brain that tracked threats, and understood, too late, that stepping into this circle was exactly what he should not have done. But he was already here, and Luca Moretti had never once in his life backed away from a thing he'd already started. "Can I have a minute?" he said. "Not a question." "You can have whatever you'd like," Elena said pleasantly. "I believe you're familiar with the concept of public spaces." Someone near the back of the press circle laughed, quickly suppressed. Luca's jaw tightened. "Privately," he said. "I don't think so." She held his gaze with the steady, open attention of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for a very long time and is not afraid of it. "Is there something you wanted to say?" He looked at her, at the necklace, at the gown, at the assembled cameras recording every millisecond of this with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of machines that don't understand what they're capturing. He looked at the woman he'd shared a home with for 4 years and had genuinely, completely failed to see, and felt something move through him that wasn't quite any single emotion. It was a compound thing, made of anger and humiliation and the first cold structural premonition of ruin, and it tasted like the back of his throat when he'd been drinking too long. "Who are you?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Elena tilted her head slightly. "You know who I am." "I knew who you told me you were." "No," she said. "You knew what you assumed. There's a difference. You never asked, Luca. Not once in 4 years. You decided what I was, and you stopped looking." A reporter, young, fast, already understanding that the story had just mutated into something far more valuable, said, "Mr. Moretti, are you saying Elena Vale is your wife?" The question landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples went everywhere immediately. Luca heard the shift in the crowd, the acceleration of camera shutters, the specific quality of human attention that sharpens when it smells something irreversible. He should have said nothing. He knew it even as his mouth opened. "We're married, yes," he said. 4 years. The room detonated. Vivian Cross had been at enough events in enough rooms with enough powerful men to know when a situation had become untenable. She recognized it the way an experienced sailor recognizes a change in weather. Not by any single indicator, but by the accumulated weight of small signals that together pointed in one direction. She recognized it now. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray, drank half of it in a single movement that she would later be grateful no cameras caught, and began the careful process of not being associated with what was happening 20 feet away. She moved toward the south wall of the room, where a group of people she knew professionally were gathered, and inserted herself into their conversation with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been practicing social survival since adolescence. She did not look at Luca. She kept her expression in the particular configuration of polite interest that conveyed nothing. She was, in the parlance of political damage control, creating distance. She did not, however, leave. Not yet. Because the thing about Vivian Cross was that beneath the calculation and the maintenance and the practiced social fluency, she was also genuinely curious. And what was happening over there was extraordinary, and she was human enough to want to see how it ended, even as she was smart enough to not be standing next to it when it did. The questions came fast after that, overlapping, a volley of them, and Luca stood in the middle with the specific stillness of a man whose options are narrowing in real time. Elena answered what she wanted to answer and redirected the rest with the ease of someone who had been media trained by the best handlers money could produce. Not that she'd needed much training. She had the instinct for it, the same instinct her father had, the ability to say exactly as much as served her purpose and not a syllable more. A reporter from one of the financial networks, the ones who covered the Vale Empire as a recurring beat, said, "Ms. Vale, how long have you been keeping your identity private? Was this deliberate?" "I've been living under my mother's family name for a period of time, yes," Elena said. "That was a personal choice. I wanted to understand the city and certain relationships on terms that didn't involve my father's name opening every door for me. I think most people can understand the appeal of being seen for yourself rather than your circumstances." "Did your husband know who you were?" A pause, just long enough to be meaningful. "He knows now," she said. Luca said, "Elena, The single word had more pressure in it than most sentences. She turned to look at him fully, and the cameras caught it. The two of them facing each other in the clearing the crowd had made, and what the cameras recorded was this: a man whose composure was showing its seams at the edges, and a woman who had none to show. "You lied to me," he said. His voice was low, aimed at her. Not the press, but the press had good microphones, and the room had gone quiet enough that it carried. "I omitted," she said. "There's a legal distinction, actually. You might want to familiarize yourself with it." 4 years, he said. 4 years, and you never— "I wanted to see who you were," she said. Still calm, still with that terrible, focused clarity that he'd spent 4 years reading as simplicity and was now understanding was something else entirely. "I wanted to know if you were the man I thought you were when I married you. I needed to know without the number getting in the way." A beat. The number would have gotten in the way. "So this is what? An experiment?" "It was hope," she said. "It turned into an experiment when you started treating me like furniture." Someone in the press circle made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp. Luca looked at her for 3 seconds that felt architectural, weight-bearing, the kind of time that structures things that come after. He could feel the room watching. He could feel the cameras. He could feel, with the bone-deep instinct of a man who had spent 20 years reading power dynamics, that the floor had shifted under him in a way that had no quick correction, and the awareness of it was making his chest tight in a way he didn't have a name for and wasn't going to name in public. "We need to talk," he said. "Not here." "We've had 4 years to talk," Elena said. "We didn't use them well." She turned back to the reporters, and the moment passed, or rather it didn't pass. It crystallized, became permanent in the way that moments do when they're captured on video and will be watched millions of times by people who weren't there. Luca stood at the edge of the frame for another 3 seconds, and then did the only thing available to him, which was to move away with as much controlled purpose as he could assemble. Well, he found a corner near the bar that wasn't covered by the press pool, and stood there with a glass of scotch he didn't remember ordering and tried to think. It was harder than usual. His thoughts kept sliding off the surface of what he was trying to hold on to, kept returning to specific images. Elena in the kitchen making coffee. Elena in the passenger seat of the car, looking out the window at nothing. Elena at the Hargrove dinner in her plain dark dress, watching him across the table with the expression he'd read as passive endurance, and was now rereading as something altogether different. She'd been watching him. For 4 years, she had been watching him with the calibrated attention of someone gathering information they intended to use, and he'd looked at that attention and seen nothing because he'd already decided there was nothing to see. Vincent Falcone appeared at his elbow. Vincent was 56 and built like a man who'd once done his own violence, but had since delegated it, compact and heavy-shouldered with a face that conveyed the minimum necessary. He looked at Luca and said nothing for a moment, which with Vincent meant he was deciding something. "Your wife," Vincent said. "Yeah. Elena Vale. It would appear." Vincent picked up a glass from the bar and held it without drinking. "Magnus Vale's daughter." "I know who her father is, Vincent." "Do you know what this looks like?" Luca said nothing. "It looks like," Vincent said, slow and level, "a man who married into $90 billion without knowing it, which means either he's the unluckiest genius in New York or he's the most expensive idiot." He paused. "The press is going to run both interpretations, and neither one is good for business." "I didn't know," Luca said. "I understand that." Vincent turned to look at him, and his eyes had the particular quality of a man who has survived 30 years in dangerous company by understanding people's structural weaknesses. "The question isn't what you knew. The question is what you did with what you had. And from what I just watched—" He stopped. "Let that sit for a moment. You brought Vivian Cross to this event. That's my private life. Your private life just became a press event, Luca." Vincent set his glass down with a care that communicated displeasure more clearly than volume would have. "I'm going to go talk to some people. You should figure out what you want the next hour to look like, because right now it looks like a disaster." He moved away. Luca stood with his scotch and the noise of the room pressing in from all sides and felt the very specific sensation of having been outmaneuvered by someone he'd never seen coming, and underneath that sensation, taking its time to surface, was something rawer and less manageable. Not just anger, Not just humiliation, something that lived closer to the center of a person, in the territory where ego and identity overlap, where a man keeps his understanding of what he is and what he's worth. She'd known. For 4 years, she'd known exactly what she was, and she'd stood in his kitchen making coffee while he told her she didn't know what waste looked like because she'd never had anything worth losing. The scotch went down in a single movement. Across the room, Elena was moving through conversations with the fluid ease of someone who had grown up in these rooms, who knew their grammar and their rhythms, who understood that the social architecture of events like this could be worked like any other system if you understood the underlying structure. She spoke with the CFO of a pharmaceutical company, with the deputy director of a foundation she intended to partner with 3 journalists who were writing 3 different stories about her appearance tonight, and who were, by the end of each conversation, writing slightly different versions than they'd started with, versions that had her fingerprints on them. Marcus was 20 feet away at all times, not hovering but present, the way a good wingman operates. He caught her eye once, and she gave him the smallest nod, and he relaxed a degree that probably nobody else noticed. The CEO of a media company named Harland Briggs worked his way to her side with the practiced ease of a man who understood he was getting exactly one window of opportunity and intended to use it. Briggs was 62, silver-haired, the kind of man who played 4-dimensional chess in boardrooms and thought he was the only one doing it. "Elena Vale," he said, as though confirming a fact he found pleasing. "I knew your father in Singapore, 87, 88. He was extraordinary." "He still is," she said. Briggs smiled at the correction. "Of course, I meant in those years. The ambition was palpable. You could feel it in the room." He glanced toward the area where Luca was still standing, more visible now because the press had thinned, but the strategic observers, the ones who mattered, were all tracking him in their peripheral vision. "You've had an eventful evening." "It's been a straightforward evening, actually," Elena said. "The events were all planned." Briggs looked at her with a recalibrated interest. "Your father trained you well." "I trained myself," she said pleasantly. "My father provided the material." He laughed, a genuine one, surprised out of him. "I'd like to sit down with you this month," he said. "Professionally. There are some areas of mutual interest I think we should discuss." "Have your office call Marcus Chen," she said, nodding toward her cousin. "He manages my calendar." She moved on before Briggs could extend the conversation. Not because she was done with him, but because leaving while he still wanted more was better positioning than staying until he was satisfied. That was something her father had told her at 16 during a seminar that had presented itself as a family dinner. You leave when they still want something. She'd thought it was about business. It had turned out to be about everything. Luca found Vivian near the south wall at 9:45. He'd been looking for her for 20 minutes, which had been 20 minutes of navigating a room that was tracking him with the subtle collective awareness of prey behavior. Not obvious, not pointed, but present. People who'd greeted him at the entrance with warmth were now greeting him with the slightly cooler register of individuals recalculating risk. Vivian saw him coming, and the conversation she was in finished itself with quiet efficiency, and she was standing slightly apart from the group when he reached her. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I've been here," she said. Her voice had a quality he recognized, the particular careful neutrality of someone who has decided not to show their hand yet. "We should talk." "Probably," she agreed. He looked at her. In the 4 years of their relationship, or whatever it had been, Vivian had never liked the clinical sound of that word. He'd been able to read her with reasonable accuracy. She was not a transparent woman, but she was a consistent one, and he knew her tells. The way she held her shoulders when she was angry. The specific position of her hands when she was managing down an emotion she didn't want him to see. Her hands right now were clasped in front of her, fingers interlaced, which was not a natural resting position for her, and which told him something about the effort the evening was costing her. "She's your wife," Vivian said. "Yes." "Elena Vale." "Yes." "And you genuinely didn't know?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," he said. "I didn't know." Vivian looked past him toward the area where Elena was still visible, still working the room with the unhurried authority of someone who lives here and has simply been absent for a while. "That's almost worse," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means you didn't marry money you knew about." She looked back at him, and there was something in her expression he'd never seen there before. Not anger, which he'd seen plenty of, but a kind of weary clarity, the look of a person doing arithmetic and not enjoying the results. You married her because you thought she was small, and she let you, and now you're standing in the middle of a press event looking like the man who had everything and didn't notice. The word small landed somewhere specific. He didn't show it. Vivian, I'm going to get my coat, she said. I need you to stay. For what? She asked. Not cruelly, almost with genuine curiosity. He didn't have an answer for that. He stood there looking for one and didn't find it, which was its own kind of answer. And Vivian looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone closing a chapter they've been meaning to close for a while. And then she turned and walked toward the coat check with the steady, deliberate pace of a woman who has made a decision and is executing it cleanly. He watched her go. The room continued its noise around him, glass and voices, and the distant sound of a string quartet. And Luca stood in the middle of it and felt the specific sensation of things that had seemed fixed beginning to move. Business relationships operated on reputation, and reputation operated on perception, and his perception, in this room tonight, was changing in real time in ways he couldn't quantify yet, but could feel the way you feel a shift in weather before the rain. He pulled out his phone. 3 messages from his attorney, Sal Caruso. 2 from his financial manager. 1 from Vincent that said only, "Call me when you're clear." No calls from associates who usually texted on Friday nights. No calls from the 3 business partners who'd been in the room earlier and who he'd seen speaking together in the corner 15 minutes ago before they'd left. He was not a man who panicked. He'd built 20 years of a life that required the opposite of panic, that required the kind of cold operational clarity that operated best in conditions designed to produce terror. He assembled that clarity now, brick by brick, and looked at the situation he was standing in. She had known the entire time. She had withheld her identity, legally, deliberately, with the assistance of professionals, and she had watched him, and she had evaluated him, and he had failed the evaluation so completely that she was now here at the most visible event of the New York social calendar in her mother's necklace, with her real name, and she had done it in a way that made him the story, not her reveal, his failure to see her. He put his phone in his pocket and started walking toward her. Man. She was in conversation with 2 women from a philanthropic foundation when she saw him moving. She saw it in her peripheral vision and finished her sentence before she adjusted her attention, which was a choice he noticed and which tightened something in his face. "Elena," he said, when he was close enough that it didn't need to be loud. The 2 women looked between them and found reasons to be elsewhere. "Luca," she said. They were standing near the east windows. The city was outside. Friday night, mid-November, the lights of Midtown running south in a grid that went on longer than you could see from any single window. Luca stood with his back to it and looked at his wife. "The prenup," he said. She waited. "The clause you added. What about it?" His jaw worked for a moment. "You planned this from the beginning." "I protected myself," she said. "There's a difference. You knew what you were doing when you added it. You knew I wouldn't read it carefully, because you knew how men like me operate. We look at the document we asked for and we sign it, and we don't." He stopped. The sentence had taken him somewhere he hadn't intended. He started again. "You set me up." "I created a fair agreement," she said. "What you chose not to examine in it is on you." 4 years, Elena. 4 years, she agreed. 4 years of being told I had the social presence of a librarian. 4 years of watching you decide I wasn't worth your attention because I didn't come dressed the way you wanted. 4 years of hearing my work described as handing out picture books. She said it without heat, without tears, with the composed delivery of someone who has said these words in their head enough times that they've become clean. "You had 4 years to see me. You chose not to." He looked at her, and the anger in his chest had something behind it now. Something that might in another man have been remorse, but in Luca Moretti expressed itself as a harder kind of fury, because remorse required the admission of something he was not yet built to admit. "What do you want?" he said. "I want a divorce," she said simply. "The papers are filing Monday. Diane Chu is handling it." The name registered. He knew Diane Chu by reputation. Everyone in New York who'd ever been near a significant contract dispute knew Diane Chu by reputation, and the reputation was not comfortable. "You've been planning this." "For 6 months. Yes, 6 months." He processed that. The timeline of the past 6 months reordered itself with this new information running through it, and none of what he saw was useful to him. All of this, he gestured, a small contained movement that encompassed the room and the cameras and the necklace and the gown. This was orchestrated. Yes, she said. Why like this? Why not just... Because you humiliated me publicly, she said, and for the first time the composure had something underneath it, not quite heat, but the memory of heat, the scar tissue of it. Repeatedly, in front of people. You brought her to events where I was supposed to be your wife and told me to take a cab. You told men you respect that I was ordinary. You looked at me in rooms full of people and made sure everyone could see that you had stopped seeing me. She paused. One breath. So yes, I wanted one night where you understood publicly what you had been standing next to. The string quartet in the far corner had shifted to something slower. The room breathed around them, oblivious and not oblivious. The way rooms are at events like this, where everyone is pretending not to watch the most interesting thing happening. Luca looked at Elena Vale, at his wife, at the woman he'd spent 4 years not seeing, and felt the ground continue its slow reorganization beneath him. He felt his phone vibrate in his pocket for the 4th time. He felt the particular quality of a room that has made a judgment and is in the process of acting on it, the social machinery of consequence, beginning its rotation. And he understood, standing there, that this was not the beginning of a bad night. This was the end of something that had been ending for a long time. And Elena had simply chosen the moment and the venue and the lighting, and she had chosen well, and there was nothing, not his attorneys, not his connections, not the 20 years of carefully constructed power that was going to... There was nothing, not his attorneys, not his connections, not the 20 years of carefully constructed power that was going to change the shape of what had already happened. He knew it. The knowing arrived not as a single moment, but as a series of small recognitions, each one closing a door he'd assumed was still open. He could see it in the room, in the way Vincent Falcone had not returned, in the way the city councilman who'd greeted him at the entrance was now 3 conversations deep on the opposite side of the floor, in the way the hedge fund president had found somewhere else to be. These were men who understood exposure the way animals understand weather. They were moving away from it. Luca put his phone in his pocket and looked at Elena and said the only honest thing he had left in that moment. I didn't know what you were. No, she said. You didn't. She held his gaze for one more second, steady, clear, without cruelty and without mercy. And then she turned away from him, back toward the room, back toward the people and the cameras, and the life she was reclaiming in real time. And Luca stood at the east windows with the city behind him and watched her go. His phone vibrated again. He pulled it out. The name on the screen was Sal Caruso, his attorney, and Sal had never called 4 times in one evening without it meaning something structural had broken. He answered. Tell me, he said. Sal's voice was the voice of a man who delivered bad news professionally and had learned to strip the emotion out of it the way a butcher strips fat. You need to come to the office tonight. It's 10 o'clock. I'm aware of the time. Come anyway. Luca watched Elena cross the room and receive another cluster of people who wanted proximity to her name, to the story she'd just made of herself, and felt something cold move through him that wasn't quite fear, because he'd never quite felt fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. I'll be there in an hour, he said. The car ride to Caruso's office on 52nd Street took 22 minutes in Friday night traffic. Luca sat in the back and did not look at his phone and did not think about Elena and thought about almost nothing else. The city moved past the windows with its customary indifference. He'd always liked New York at night from inside a car. The compressed version of it, the way the lights compressed distance, the way everything looked manageable from this remove. It didn't look manageable tonight. Sal Caruso's office occupied half a floor of a building that didn't advertise its tenants. Sal was 60. A former federal prosecutor who'd crossed the aisle 20 years ago and never looked back, and his office looked like the inside of his mind, dense with files, precise in its organization, containing nothing that hadn't been placed there deliberately. He was behind his desk when Luca came in, jacket off, which meant he'd been there for hours. His associate, a young woman named Brianna Park, who was the sharpest person in any room she entered and who Sal kept at his side for exactly that reason, was at the small conference table with a laptop and 3 legal pads covered in notes. "Sit down," Sal said. Luca sat. "Talk." "The prenuptial agreement." Sal opened a folder and turned it to face Luca across the desk. "Specifically the clause on page 11. Subsection 4, paragraph 3. Luca looked at the page. He'd read this document. He'd had Sal review it. He'd believed it was protecting him from Elena making claims against his business interests in the event of a divorce. And that was what it had been presented as. And that was what Sal had confirmed, and that was— "Walk me through it," he said. "The language here," Sal said, pointing to a paragraph that Luca read now with the specific focus of someone who understands they've been reading a map upside down. "Waives any claim by either party to undisclosed assets. We read it as protecting your holdings. She read it as protecting hers." He paused. "Her attorney, Diane Chu, you know the name." "I know the name. Diane Chu drafted this language. She inserted it as an amendment to the standard agreement, and my office reviewed it, and—" Sal stopped. There was a quality to the pause that told Luca something about how much this was costing his attorney to say out loud. "We missed it, Luca. The clause is symmetrical on its face. Both parties waive claims to undisclosed assets. We were focused on your assets. We didn't consider that she had any." The room was very quiet. Brianna Park did not look up from her legal pad. "What does that mean?" Luca said, specifically. "It means that her inheritance, her stake in Vail Global Holdings, the trust structure, the entirety of the Vail estate, none of it is reachable. She had it at the time of signing. It wasn't disclosed. The clause holds under New York law. I've had 2 partners look at it tonight since her name hit the wire." Sal held eye contact because he was the kind of man who delivered information directly when he'd failed and understood that looking away was worse. "We have no claim. Not to the estate, not to the holding stake, not to anything that traces back to Vail." Luca sat with this for a moment. The number moved through his mind, $90 billion, and the geometry of it, the sheer scale of what he'd been adjacent to for 4 years without knowing, produced a sensation he'd never had before in a business context, a kind of vertigo. The floor was the same floor it had been 3 seconds ago, and it felt like a different floor. "The apartment," he said. "Standard division. New York law. Whatever's jointly held. The accounts. Joint accounts, yes. Business accounts are yours. They're clean." Sal leaned forward slightly. "Luca, the business accounts are the immediate concern, not the divorce settlement." "What does that mean?" Sal looked at him. "Diane Chu filed a request for financial disclosure this evening at 9:17. It was time-stamped 3 minutes after your exchange with Elena at the Gala became public record. They've been running parallel tracks. The social event was one piece of it. The legal apparatus was already moving. Luca felt the shape of it then. The full architecture of what she'd built. Not one plan, but 2. The public event, which was the visible face of it, the cameras and the gown and the necklace and the room full of witnesses. And underneath that, invisible, the legal infrastructure that had been in motion for 6 months, waiting for tonight to activate. One track for his reputation, one track for his finances. "The disclosure request," he said. What are they after?" "Everything," Sal said. "Standard divorce procedure, but given the public nature of tonight, given that there are now approximately 40 journalists who have the story and are running it as of—" Brianna turned her laptop around so he could see the screen. "A financial news site. The headline was already there. Mafia boss's wife revealed as $90 billion heiress at NYC Gala. The timestamp was 40 minutes ago. Given all of that," Sal continued, "the financial disclosure is going to produce scrutiny from the press, from the public, potentially from others." The word "others" sat in the room with the specific weight of a word chosen because the more accurate word was too dangerous to say in an office with walls. "Federal," Luca said. Sal said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Luca looked at the laptop screen. The headline was there, and there would be more headlines, different angles, different pieces of the story being assembled in real time by people who were very good at assembly. He thought about the financial disclosure. The business accounts Sal had called clean. They were clean in the sense that they had been constructed to appear clean, which was a different thing. And in the ordinary course of events, the distinction was academic, because the ordinary course of events didn't involve a $90 billion divorce filing, generating federal interest in a Friday night. What's my exposure? He said. Depends on how deep they look, Sal said, and how motivated they are. He paused again. The story tonight made you a public figure in a way you haven't been before. The Mafia Association is public record. The Moretti name is known. But you've been careful. The businesses have been structured carefully. The question is whether the divorce proceeding creates an avenue they can use to look at things that have been off limits. Can we slow the filing? We can contest certain elements. We can request extensions. We can... Sal stopped. We can delay. We cannot prevent. The clause holds, Luca. I've had 3 people look at it. Diane Chu wrote it clean. There's nothing in it to attack. Luca sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks at a ceiling when he's running out of other places to look. Then he looked back at Sal. She knew about the federal exposure, he said. It wasn't a question. He was thinking out loud, working through the architecture of what she'd built. She knew that a public divorce filing would generate this. Almost certainly, Sal said. She used it. She created conditions that produce pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Sal said it without inflection, the way you describe a mechanism. The press exposure makes you visible. The visibility creates interest. The interest creates scrutiny. The scrutiny creates... He stopped. Leverage, Luca said. That's one word for it. He sat there with the comprehensive wreckage of the evening spread across the desk in legal documents and search results, and Sal's careful, damaging recitation of facts. He was thinking about Elena in that kitchen at 2 a.m, making coffee. He was thinking about the way she'd looked at him across the Gala floor when his name registered with the press. The look that had taken him 3 seconds to process, and which he now understood completely. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't anger. It was the look of someone who had waited long enough and was finally setting something down. He'd called her ordinary for 4 years. He'd called her a nobody. She'd been building a case. Boss. He left Caruso's office at 11:40 and stood on the sidewalk on 52nd Street and let the cold hit him. November in New York had a particular quality at this hour, sharp and clear and without sympathy. He stood in it for a moment without moving. His phone had 21 notifications. He didn't look at them. He put the phone in his pocket and stood on the sidewalk and tried to think clearly, which was harder than usual because the things he normally used to think clearly, certainty about his position, certainty about his resources, the bedrock sense of being the most dangerous person in any negotiation, were all compromised tonight in ways he hadn't cataloged yet. A car went past. Then another. The city maintained its indifference. He started walking. He needed to move. He'd always thought better moving than standing still, and he needed to think about Vincent Falcone, who hadn't returned his calls, and about the 3 business partners who'd left the Gala without speaking to him, and about what Sal had said about federal interest, and about the specific, terrible intelligence of what Elena had constructed. She'd had 6 months. 6 months of living in his penthouse, making coffee, going to the literacy center, existing in the margins of his life the way she always had, and the whole time the apparatus had been building. Diane Chu with the legal infrastructure, Marcus Chen managing the timing, the gown, the necklace, the event, chosen because it was the most visible possible venue, because it would produce maximum documentation, because it would make the story unignorable and him unignorable within it. He stopped at the corner of 52nd and Lexington. A food cart was still operating, the vendor inside doing something mechanical and repetitive. Luca stood at the corner and felt, underneath the operational analysis, something that wasn't useful and wasn't going away. The raw and specific humiliation of being outthought by someone he'd decided wasn't thinking. He'd seen her as furniture. She'd been running calculations. He pulled out his phone and called the one number he hadn't tried yet. It rang 3 times and picked up. "I need a conversation," Luca said. "Tonight." The voice on the other end was Danny Reese, his oldest lieutenant, the man who'd been with him since the beginning, since the early years when being with Luca Moretti meant you ate what you earned and earned through things that left marks. Danny was 50 and careful, and had never once in 20 years done anything that wasn't in Luca's interest. "I heard," Danny said. His voice had something in it, not quite the bass line, something slightly off. "Then you know I need to talk." A pause that lasted 2 seconds too long. "Danny," Luca said. I'm here. Come to the apartment, half an hour. Another pause. Shorter this time, but still there, still containing that quality Luca couldn't quite read and was beginning to dislike intensely. I've got a situation tonight, Luca. Tomorrow morning. Tonight, Luca said. Half an hour. He hung up before Danny could respond and stood at the corner with the phone in his hand and felt the edges of something he wasn't ready to name. Danny Reese did not have situations on Friday nights that prevented him from responding to a direct call. Danny Reese had not had a situation of that kind in 20 years. The pause had been 2 seconds too long, and the voice had been 2 degrees too careful, and Luca had spent 20 years reading those degrees in other men, and he was reading them now in the man he'd trusted most, and the reading was producing a result he needed to be wrong about. He walked the remaining 12 blocks to the penthouse. He didn't take a car. He needed the air and the movement and the time. He went through the lobby and rode the elevator to 43 and let himself into the apartment and stood in the entryway in his coat. The penthouse was dark except for the ambient light of the city coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Elena's things were here. Her coat on the hook by the door, the specific coat she wore to the literacy center, dark green and practical. Her books on the side table, the evidence of her presence threaded through a space he'd thought of as his. He moved to the living room and sat down without turning on a light and looked at the city through the glass. He sat there for 25 minutes. His phone produced notifications he didn't read. His mind worked steadily through the structure of his situation and kept arriving at the same set of conclusions, none of which were acceptable, all of which were probably accurate. At 11 minutes past midnight, the elevator chimed. Danny Reese came into the apartment and found Luca in the dark and didn't ask why the lights were off, which told Luca something. A man with a clear conscience asks about the dark. Danny moved to the living room and sat across from him without being invited to sit, which told Luca something else. Talk, Luca said. Danny was a compact man with gray in his hair and hands that had done considerable work in their time. He sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at Luca, and that moment, brief, maybe 3 seconds, was 3 seconds in which everything that came after was visible to anyone paying attention. There's something you need to know, Danny said. Luca said nothing. He kept his face clean and his breathing even. These were things he could control. He controlled them. The Falcone meeting Tuesday, Danny said. Vincent didn't call it for a deal. Then why? Danny's jaw worked. He was a man who delivered bad news before, and he wasn't comfortable, and comfort wasn't the point. He called it because of you, because of the direction things have been moving. The Hargrove situation last spring, and then the Delano contract falling through, and... He stopped, recalibrated. There's been conversation, Luca, about the organization, about whether the current structure is... Say it clearly, Luca said. His voice was very quiet. The quieter Luca Moretti's voice got, the more dangerous the air in the room became, and Danny knew this, had known it for 20 years, and was saying what he was saying anyway, which meant the situation had outgrown the usual deterrents. Vincent is moving to restructure, Danny said. The conversation Tuesday wasn't about a deal. It was about removing you from the primary position, temporarily, while the exposure from tonight gets managed. The room was completely quiet for 5 seconds. Temporarily, Luca said. Danny looked at him and said nothing, which was the answer. And you were at the Tuesday meeting, Luca said. The pause was shorter this time. Danny was past the point of managing his tells. Yes, you were at the meeting where they discussed removing me. I was. And you didn't tell me. Danny looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has done something he can't undo and has made his peace with it in the way that people make peace with things they can't undo, imperfectly, with residue. I needed to understand the scope of it first. I wasn't sure it was real. I thought it might be preliminary conversation. Nothing. Danny. The single word closed the sentence like a door. Silence. 20 years, Luca said. He didn't say it with heat or with grief. He said it the way you state a number on a balance sheet. 20 years and you sat in that room. I sat in the room, Danny said. I didn't agree to anything. You sat in the room and you didn't call me. Danny looked at him steadily. There was something in his face that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance, something that lived between them. in the territory of a man who has run a calculation and arrived at a result he isn't proud of but has decided to live with. The situation has changed, Luca. Tonight changed it further. Vincent and the others, they're not wrong that the exposure creates problems. The federal angle, the press, don't. Luca stood up. Not quickly, not with the energy of anger, but with the slow, deliberate movement of a man who has decided the conversation is over. He stood and looked at Danny Reese, who he'd eaten with and worked with and trusted in the absolute and unreserved way that you only trust people you've been in real danger with. And he looked at him with the clean, cold recognition of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time. "You've already decided," he said. Danny said nothing. "You're here because you thought you owed me the face-to-face," Luca said, "not because you're still with me." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and confirmed everything, and Luca stood in his dark living room with the city behind him and understood that in the space of one Friday night he had lost the following: his wife, the illusion of who his wife was, his best attorney's confidence, his financial position relative to the divorce, his primary lieutenant, and the organizational support of the structure he'd spent 20 years building. He understood it with the same cold operational clarity he brought to everything, and he stood in it and let it be as large as it was. Danny stood. He moved toward the elevator with the careful pace of a man leaving a room that might still be dangerous and knowing it. He stopped with his hand on the elevator panel. "For what it's worth," he said. "It's worth nothing," Luca said. "Go." The elevator door closed. Luca stood alone in the dark penthouse with Elena's coat on the hook by the door, and the city producing its indifferent light through 43 floors of glass, and he felt the ground beneath him for what it actually was. Not solid, not permanent, not the foundation he'd believed it to be, but something he'd constructed from materials that had always had their limits. And those limits had been reached, and he was standing on the other side of them now in territory he had never prepared for because he had never once seriously believed he would arrive. He stood there for a long time after the elevator closed. The city outside the windows kept doing what the city always did. Indifferent, relentless, burning its 10,000 lights into the November dark. And Luca Moretti stood in his living room with his coat still on and felt the specific quality of a man who has reached the end of a long road and found nothing at the terminus except the evidence of his own decisions. He didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window until 3 in the morning, and then he got up and made coffee because making coffee was something to do with his hands, and his hands needed something to do. He stood at the counter and drank it black and looked at Elena's coat on the hook by the door and thought about 20 years of building something that had, in the space of one night, shown him what it was made of. Not nothing. He was clear-eyed enough to see that. The organization was real, the money was real, the power he'd accumulated was real, but it had been built on the assumption that he was the most dangerous variable in any situation he entered, and that assumption had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had been sitting in his kitchen for 4 years making coffee and going to the literacy center and watching him decide she wasn't worth watching. At 4 in the morning, he called Sal Caruso. Sal answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't slept either. "I need options," Luca said. "I've been working on options," Sal said. "Come in at 7. He was there at 6:50. The options, as Sal laid them out across the conference table in the gray early light of a Saturday morning, were not good. They were the options available to a man in a position that had been architecturally compromised, workable, but requiring the kind of concession that left marks. The divorce proceedings were essentially uncontestable on the asset question. Diane Chu's clause held. Luca would receive his share of jointly held property under standard New York law, which amounted to the apartment they'd need to negotiate the buyout, and the joint accounts, which were substantial but not transformative. The Vail estate was untouchable. The Vail Global Holdings stake was untouchable. Everything that made Elena Vail who she was on paper was on the other side of a legal wall that Sal's 3 partners had now examined from every angle and found without a seam. "The disclosure request," Sal said. "We can push back on scope. We can argue that certain business entities are outside the marital estate and therefore not subject to—" "Will it hold?" Luca said. Sal's pause was brief and honest. "In front of the right judge, possibly. In front of the wrong judge, no." "And the federal angle." "That depends on what the disclosure surfaces and who's looking at it and how motivated they are." Sal looked at him across the table. "Luca, I have to ask you directly. Is there anything in the business accounts that a motivated examiner would find actionable? The question sat in the room between them. Sal, Luca said, I know what I'm asking. Then you know I can't answer it here. Sal nodded once. He'd expected that answer, and it had told him what he needed to know, and they both understood that and moved on. The press situation is separate from the legal situation. The press situation is... He paused. The press situation is significant. The story broke on 6 major outlets last night. It's on 4 financial networks this morning. The framing is consistent. Mafia boss, secret heiress wife, public confrontation. You are the story, Luca, not Elena. She's the revelation. You're the... He stopped. Say it. You're the man who didn't see it. The words landed in the specific way that true things land when you've been avoiding them. Luca sat with them for a moment and then put them aside because they weren't operationally useful, and operational utility was what this moment required. Vincent Falcone, he said. What about him? I need a meeting today. Sal looked at him carefully. Is that wise? It's necessary. Whether it's wise is a secondary question. He pulled out his phone and checked the screen. 14 messages overnight. None from Vincent. 2 from people in the organization's outer ring. Carefully worded texts that conveyed their awareness of the situation without committing to any particular loyalty. The kind of communication that told you where a person actually stood more clearly than anything they could have said directly. Set it up. Noon. Neutral ground. But they... The meeting with Vincent Falcone happened at a restaurant in Midtown that both men had used for years for conversations that required privacy and plausible normalcy. It was the kind of place where the tables were far enough apart to prevent easy eavesdropping, and where the staff understood that some conversations were not their business, and it operated on the mutual understanding that the men who used it for this purpose were the reason it remained profitable. Vincent was already seated when Luca arrived. He was drinking water and reading something on his phone with the focused calm of a man who has had the night to prepare for this meeting and has done so. He looked up when Luca sat down, and his face was the face he used in negotiations. Open enough to communicate engagement, closed enough to communicate nothing about his position. Luca, he said. Vincent. Luca settled into the chair and didn't open the menu because they weren't here for food, and pretending otherwise would be a waste of time. Danny told me about Tuesday. I figured he would. Vincent set his phone face down on the table. I want you to know I didn't ask him to keep it from you. He chose to. He chose to. Vincent held his gaze steadily, which tells you something about how people are reading the situation. When your closest people start making independent calculations, it means the perception of your position has changed. My position hasn't changed. Your exposure has. Which, in this business, is the same thing. Vincent picked up his water glass and held it. Last night was a problem, Luca. The press coverage this morning is a larger problem. The financial disclosure filing is the problem behind the problem. He set the glass down. People who have been comfortable operating in proximity to you are now doing arithmetic about what comfortable means going forward, including you. Including me. Yes. The honesty of it was, in its way, more destabilizing than anger would have been. Luca had known Vincent for 16 years. They'd built things together and protected things together and buried things together in the figurative sense that men in their business buried things. And Vincent had always been straight with him, even when straight was uncomfortable, which was part of why Luca had trusted him. The trust was still there. That was the problem. The trust was still there, and Vincent was using it to tell him something he didn't want to hear with the particular frankness of a man who isn't trying to wound you. The restructuring conversation, Luca said. It was preliminary, nothing decided. But the direction was decided. Vincent was quiet for a moment. A waiter passed at a distance and neither of them moved. The direction of the conversation was toward creating some structural separation between your personal exposure and the organization's exposure, temporarily, while the legal situation resolves. He paused. That's not the same as removing you. It's exactly the same as removing me, and you know it. Luca's voice stayed level. He kept it level with the specific effort of a man who has learned that controlled anger is more dangerous than expressed anger. If I step back, the separation becomes permanent. The organization finds its equilibrium without me, And the equilibrium doesn't include me. That's not temporary. That's Succession wearing a temporary costume. Vincent said nothing, which was the second confirmation of the morning. I'm not stepping back, Luca said. Then you need to manage the exposure, Vincent said. The federal question? I'm managing it. You need to manage it faster than the disclosure timeline. Vincent leaned forward slightly. Luca, I'm telling you this as someone who has known you for 16 years and wants to see you on the other side of this. The divorce is one thing, the disclosure is another. If the disclosure produces the kind of examination that produces the kind of result that... He stopped, chose his words with the care of a man speaking near invisible lines. You need it to not produce that result, by any means available to you. The sentence had a weight that went beyond its literal content. Luca heard what was underneath it. He sat with it for a moment and felt the shape of what Vincent was actually asking. Not explicitly, never explicitly, because men in their position had learned the grammar of implication over decades. And he felt the full terrible landscape of his options as of this moment, Saturday morning, less than 12 hours after the worst night of his professional life. I understand, he said. Vincent nodded. Once. Good. He picked up the menu he also wasn't going to use and set it back down, a gesture of finality. The organization will hold while you manage this. I want to be clear about that. We're not moving against you. We're asking you to move with us. There's a difference, Luca said. There is. Vincent met his eyes. I need you to see it. Luca sat in that for a moment, in the particular quality of it. 16 years, a restaurant table, a conversation that had the surface texture of a business discussion and the interior structure of an ultimatum. He looked at Vincent Falcone and understood that this was the last version of this man who would ever speak to him as an equal, and that what came after this conversation depended entirely on what he did in the next 72 hours. Give me until Monday, he said. Plus, he left the restaurant at 1:15 and stood on the sidewalk in the cold and called Marcus Chen. The call was not a thing he'd planned. He'd been walking toward his car and his phone was in his hand, and the decision happened with the rapid instinctive logic of a man who has run out of conventional moves and is beginning to operate from the part of himself that existed before strategy, before construction, before 20 years of careful architecture. Marcus answered after 4 rings. Moretti, he said. Not surprised. Not warm. I need to talk to Elena. No. Marcus, she's not available to you. His voice was clean and direct, without performance. Diane Chu handles all contact from this point. You have her number. This isn't legal business. Everything between you and my cousin is legal business now. That's what happens when you file for divorce. A pause. Or she does, technically, which you'll find out Monday. I know about Monday, Luca said. I know about the timeline. I know about all of it. He stopped walking. He was on the corner of 53rd and 6th, and the Saturday afternoon city was moving around him with its full, indifferent Saturday energy. Tourists and cabs, and a man selling roasted nuts from a cart, and 2 kids on bicycles weaving through the pedestrian traffic. I need 5 minutes with her. Why? The question was simple, and he didn't have a simple answer. He stood there with the phone at his ear and tried to find an honest version of what he needed, and it came out rougher than he intended. Rougher than the calibrated control he'd been maintaining since 11 o'clock the previous night. Because I need to say something to her directly, he said. Not through attorneys, not in a courtroom. To her. The silence on Marcus's end lasted 4 seconds. I'll ask her, he said finally. I'm not promising anything. The call ended. Luca stood on the corner and put his phone in his pocket and stood in the cold for a moment and breathed. Just breathed. Which was something he'd stopped doing well somewhere around 3 in the morning and hadn't recovered yet. Up. Elena was at the Vale offices when Marcus relayed the request. She was at the long table in the main conference room with Diane Chu and 2 of Diane's associates, working through the Monday filing documentation with the focused efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this process to begin and was now fully engaged with its execution. She was wearing her own clothes today, not the gown, not the necklace, just dark slacks and a simple cream sweater, the kind of thing she'd worn to the literacy center. And she looked, Diane thought privately, like a woman who had set something down after carrying it too long and was only now discovering the full relief of empty hands. Marcus came in and said, "He wants 5 minutes to talk. Not legal." Diane looked up. "Absolutely not." Elena looked at Marcus. "What did he sound like?" "Like a man running out of road," Marcus said. A beat. Diane said, "Elena." "Tell him an hour," Elena said. "Here, with you in the room and Diane next door." She looked at her attorney. "Everything he says is on record. I'm not meeting him alone and I'm not giving him anything operational, but I'll hear what he has to say." Diane looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a professional who has learned to trust her client's instincts while reserving the right to document her objections. "On record," she said, "and I'm 10 feet away." 10 feet is fine," Elena said. "Det." He arrived at 2:45. Elena was already in the room when he came in, seated at the head of the conference table that had been her father's design choice, a long piece of pale oak that conveyed seriousness without aggression. Marcus was against the far wall with his arms crossed. The door to the adjacent office was ajar, and there were sounds from it that indicated Diane was present and working. Luca came in and looked at the room and looked at Elena, and for a moment he just stood there, coat on, something in his face that she'd never seen on it before. Not anger, not the compressed, managed control he wore the way other men wore watches. Something raw, something that had been, she thought, sitting underneath the control for a very long time and had finally found its way to the surface through the cracks that the last 18 hours had made. He sat down across from her, not at the far end. 3 seats down, close enough to talk without the table as a stage. "I'm not here to negotiate," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not here to ask you to change anything. The filing, the clause, the—" He stopped, ran a hand across his jaw, a gesture she recognized as involuntary, one of his few involuntary physical expressions. "None of that. That's done." "Then what?" she said. He looked at her, and the light in the conference room was the flat, neutral light of a professional space that didn't accommodate sentiment, and in that light Luca Moretti looked, for the first time in the 4 years she'd known him, his age. "I need to understand something," he said. She waited. "The 4 years, living the way you lived, the library, the center, the—" He paused. "Was any of it real? Were you actually there, in any of it, or was it all—" He stopped again. He was finding this harder than he'd anticipated. She could see that. And she let him find it hard because it was hard, and he'd been the cause of most of the difficulty, and she wasn't going to rescue him from the effort of saying what he'd come to say. "It was all real," she said. "The library was real. The center was real. Darnell learning to read was real." She kept her voice even. "What did you think it was?" "I thought it was—" He looked at the table for a moment. "I thought it was you settling, filling time. I thought—" He stopped for the 3rd time, and there was something in the stop that was different from the previous ones. Less managed, more actual. "I thought you were small," he said. "I looked at you, and I decided you were small, and I stopped looking. And everything I missed was on the other side of that decision." The room was quiet. From the adjacent office came the faint sound of a keyboard. Elena sat with what he'd said and let it exist as what it was. Not an apology, not quite, but the closest thing to one that a man with his specific construction could produce, which was a statement of what he'd done stated clearly, without excuse, with the particular courage of someone who has been stripped of the resources that usually protect him from clarity. "I know you did," she said. "I'm sorry." 2 words. They came out with the rough, unpolished quality of words that haven't been said often enough to have a comfortable texture. "For what I said, the things—" He paused. "The things I said about you in front of people. That was—" He stopped. "Wrong," she said quietly. "Wrong," he said. "Yes." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it. It had a different weight. Not resolution. She wasn't naive enough to call it that, and neither was he. But something honest, a piece of true exchange in a relationship that had been starved of it. Then Marcus said from the wall, "There's something else. That's not why you're here." Luca looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back with the unimpressed directness of a man who has been protecting his cousin for 4 years and has no intention of stopping. "The federal exposure," Marcus said. "You're here because it frightens you. The disclosure frightens you. And you're hoping that if you come here and say the right things, Elena will—" "What?" Slow the filing, modify the scope, give you room to... Marcus, Elena said. I'm saying what Diane would say, Marcus said. And Diane is right. Luca looked at Elena. Something crossed his face. Not the denial she'd expected, not the manufactured indignation of a man falsely accused. He looked at her and said nothing, which told her that Marcus was not entirely wrong, and he knew it. She felt it then. Not anger. Something quieter and heavier. The understanding that even this, the raw, undefended thing he'd just offered, the closest thing to honesty he'd brought to this table, was not entirely separate from what he needed from her. That even now, at the stripped-down bottom of everything, the line between what was real in him and what was operational was not clean. She sat with that for a moment. Let it fully arrive. I can't help you with the disclosure, she said. I won't. Elena, the filing goes Monday. The scope is what Diane determined it should be. I'm not going to modify that. She held his gaze. But I want you to hear something. He waited. What you said about the library, about Darnell, about the things being real. She kept her voice level, but let something into it that she'd been keeping out of it for 2 years, the actual weight of the actual thing. I needed you to see that. For 4 years, I needed you to see that those things had value, not because of what they meant for your image or your social position or your... She stopped, breathed. Because they were real. Because the people there were real. Because Darnell learned to read at 54 years old in a room where nobody was going to give him anything for it except the thing itself. She paused. You could have seen that. You chose not to. He looked at her, and his face had the quality of a man receiving something he'd needed for a long time, that had arrived too late to be useful in the way it should have been useful, and the tragedy of the timing was in both their faces simultaneously. I know, he said. I know that now. She nodded once, slowly. I believe you, she said. And she did. That was the part she hadn't expected. That she would sit across from Luca Moretti at 2:50 on a Saturday afternoon in her father's conference room, and mean it when she said it. She believed he saw it now. She believed the night had broken something open in him that the years of her quiet presence had never managed to crack. She believed all of it. It didn't change what came next. Understanding arrived too late was still arrived too late. The filing would go Monday. The clause would hold. The life she was building would go on being built, with or without his comprehension of what he'd wasted. But she believed him. He stood to go. He was at the door when she said his name. Luca. He turned. The Tuesday meeting. Vincent and the others. She held his gaze. You need to know that what's happening to your organization right now is not something I engineered. I didn't contact Vincent. I didn't approach your people. Whatever's moving there is moving because of what you built and what you did. Not because of me. He looked at her for a long moment. I know that, he said. I'm saying it anyway. He nodded. Once. He opened the door and went out, and Marcus moved to the window, and they watched the car pull away from the building on Park Avenue. And Elena sat at the long, pale oak table and felt the full complicated weight of the last 24 hours settle into her bones like weather. Marcus turned from the window. You okay? I will be, she said. The same thing she'd told him 6 months ago on the phone. It was still true. It was becoming more true by the hour. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at the screen. A message from Diane, sent from 10 feet away in the adjacent office. Monday is still Monday. She typed back. I know. Monday is still Monday. She set the phone down and looked at the city through the conference room window. Saturday afternoon, the light going early the way it did in November, the streets below full of ordinary people doing ordinary Saturday things. And she felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief and the strange, quiet relief, something else beginning. Something that had been waiting behind everything else for a very long time. Not anger, not vindication, not the particular satisfaction of a plan fully executed. Something more fundamental than any of those. The sensation of her own life opening up in front of her like a road that has been there the whole time, waiting for her to turn toward it, and the road had been there the whole time. She just needed the storm to clear before she could see it. She sat at the long, pale oak table for another 20 minutes after Luca's car pulled away from the building, and she let the silence of the conference room do what silence does when you finally stop filling it. It settled into the true shape of things, unhurried, without commentary. Diane came in at some point and set a cup of tea on the table without saying anything, which was one of the reasons Elena trusted her absolutely. Diane understood that some moments required the absence of professional counsel. She set the cup down and went back to the adjacent office and closed the door quietly. Marcus had gone to make calls. He was always making calls. Elena sat alone with the tea and the city outside the window, and the knowledge that Monday was 2 days away, and that 2 days was enough time to feel the full weight of everything before the machinery of consequence began its final rotation. She thought about what Luca had said. Not the apology, or the thing adjacent to apology that he'd managed to produce, but the part before it. The part where he'd said he'd decided she was small and stopped looking. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's been living underneath it. Not because you want what's there, but because you need to know. She wasn't angry. That surprised her still, even now. She'd expected to feel something fiercer on the other side of this. Some sustained heat, some righteous momentum that would carry her through the logistics of dissolution and into the next chapter with the clean, propulsive energy of having been proven right. Instead, she felt something more complicated and less useful and ultimately more honest. She felt the specific grief of a thing that had been real once and had failed. Not fraudulent from the beginning, failed. There was a difference, and she was honest enough to hold it. The tea went cold. She didn't drink it. She looked at the city until the light was fully gone, and then she gathered her things and went home. Not to the penthouse on 43, which she hadn't returned to since Friday morning, but to the apartment Marcus had arranged for her in a building on the Upper West Side that the Vale organization maintained for exactly this kind of transition. It was smaller than the penthouse and furnished in the neutral, purposeful way of a space that's meant to be temporary, and she found she liked it immediately, liked the smallness of it, the way it contained only what was necessary. She made her own dinner, pasta, from scratch, on a Saturday night with no agenda. She ate it at the kitchen table with the window open a crack so she could hear the street below, the ordinary Saturday sounds of a city that didn't know her name tonight and didn't need to. And it was, she thought, the best meal she'd eaten in years. Monday arrived without ceremony. The filing went in at 9:17 in the morning, exactly as Diane had planned. By noon, the financial press had it. By 2 o'clock, it was on the general news cycle, folded into the larger story that had been building since Friday night. The story of Elena Vale, who had married a man who called her nothing and turned out to be everything, which was the version the press preferred because it had a clean shape that fit the formats they worked in. Elena didn't try to correct the shape. It wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just compressed. Reality was less clean than the story they were telling, but the story they were telling was not untrue, and she'd learned enough about information to know that you managed what you could and let the rest find its own level. She spent Monday in the Vale offices working through the initial documentation with Diane and 2 of Diane's associates, and by the end of the day, the immediate legal framework was established. The clause held. The asset structure was clear. The Vale estate remained untouched. Luca's attorneys had filed a motion that morning contesting the scope of the financial disclosure, which Diane had anticipated and prepared for and responded to with the efficient devastation of someone who had written the original document and knew precisely where every vulnerability in the contest was located. "He's going to drag it," Diane said at 5 o'clock when they were reviewing the day's filings. "Not the asset question. He knows he can't win that. But he'll extend the process on the procedural elements. His attorneys are good at delay." "How long?" Elena said. 6 months. Possibly 9. It won't change the outcome." "Then we let it take however long it takes," Elena said. "I'm not in a hurry." Diane looked at her with the assessing attention she brought to everything. "The federal situation is developing separately. Whatever happens there is outside the divorce proceeding. You understand that?" "I understand." "It has no bearing on your position." "I know." Elena looked at her attorney. "Diane, I'm not hoping for anything bad to happen to him. I want to be clear about that." Diane held her gaze for a moment. "Noted," she said, in the tone of a professional who was noting it without necessarily believing it was the whole truth, which was fair, because the truth was complicated and the whole of it didn't fit neatly into a single statement. The truth was that Elena had filed the divorce knowing about the federal exposure. She'd known for 2 years, had learned it piece by piece through the same patient, unacknowledged observation that had taught her everything else about the life she'd been living. And she'd understood that the financial disclosure created by the divorce filing would produce scrutiny that was already looking for a door. She hadn't manufactured that scrutiny. She hadn't directed it. She had simply filed for divorce and let the machinery of consequence proceed at the pace the machinery of consequence naturally proceeded. She hadn't engineered his ruin. She'd declined to prevent it. Whether that distinction mattered was a question she'd been living with for 6 months and intended to keep living with, because it was the kind of question that deserved sustained attention rather than a comfortable resolution. The federal inquiry became public 3 weeks later. It was a preliminary investigation, which in the grammar of these situations meant it was formal but not yet terminal, and the specific nature of it had to do with financial structures that connected the Moretti organization to legitimate business entities in ways that had been carefully constructed to resist exactly this kind of examination. The examinations had gotten better. The resistance, it turned out, had limits. Elena read about it on a Tuesday morning over coffee, in the same kitchen in the Upper West Side apartment, with the same window open. She read it the way she read most news, fully, without allowing herself the shortcuts of skim and assumption. And when she was done, she set her phone face down on the table and sat with the knowledge of it for a while. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd prepared herself for triumph as a possible response, and it didn't arrive. What arrived was something quieter and more ambiguous, a sadness that lived alongside the relief. The way two incompatible things can occupy the same space in a person if the person is large enough to hold them both without forcing a resolution. She called Marcus. "I saw," he said when he picked up. "How is he?" she said. A brief silence. "You don't have to." "I'm asking," she said. "I'm not asking for sympathy, and I'm not asking because I want to intervene. I'm asking because he was my husband for 4 years, and I'm allowed to ask how he is." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Sal Caruso's managing it. The investigation is preliminary. It's not arrest level. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on what they find." He paused. "He's operational. He's dealing with it." "Vincent," she said. "Vincent moved 2 weeks ago. The restructuring is done." Another pause. "Luca's out of the primary position. He still has his business interests, the legitimate ones. The organization it's not his anymore. Not in the way it was." She sat with that. "He saw it coming." "He did," Marcus said. "He knew from Saturday. He just couldn't stop it." She nodded to herself. She thought about the restaurant meeting she'd heard about, not from Marcus, who didn't know she knew, but from Diane, who had sources she didn't explain and Elena had learned not to ask about. She thought about Luca sitting across from Vincent Falcone at a table they'd used for 16 years and understanding in real time the shape of what he'd built and what it had decided it didn't need anymore. 20 years. And at the end of it, the thing you built looks at you and makes a calculation. "Okay," she said. "Thank you." "Elena," Marcus said, "are you okay?" "I'm sad," she said, which was true. "And I'm okay. Both." He understood that. He let it stand without requiring her to pick one. The penthouse sold in February. It sold quickly because Manhattan penthouses at that price point sold quickly to the right buyers, and the right buyer appeared with minimal delay. A tech executive from San Francisco relocating for reasons that had nothing to do with Elena or Luca or any part of the story that had been living inside those walls. The proceeds were divided according to the law, cleanly, without the additional contest that Elena had half expected. Luca's attorneys signed off without a fight on the apartment, which told her something about where his attention and resources were currently focused, and she didn't read it as concession so much as prioritization. She hadn't gone back. She'd had Marcus arrange for her things to be collected while Luca was at a meeting, organized by someone in his office, who communicated with Marcus's assistant with the careful neutrality of two people managing the logistics of an ending neither of them caused. Her books. The green coat. A small collection of objects that had been hers before the marriage and remained hers after it. She hadn't wanted any of the furniture, any of the art, any of the deliberate expensive choices Luca had made to construct a certain image in a certain space. She wanted her coat and her books and the specific coffee mug she'd bought at a street market in Brooklyn 18 months into the marriage, On a Sunday morning when she'd gone alone and spent 3 hours walking the stalls and felt, briefly, like herself. She kept the mug on the windowsill in the Upper West Side apartment where she could see it when she made her morning coffee. Vail Global Holdings announced Elena's appointment to the board in March. It was a formal announcement, the kind that came with a press release and professional photographs, and the particular language of corporate communication that manages to be simultaneously informative and empty of genuine content, but the fact it conveyed was real. Magnus Vail's daughter had come home, and she had brought with her 4 years of living outside the name, outside the number, outside the insulation that $90 billion provides. And she had opinions about what the company should do with its position that hadn't previously been represented in the boardroom. Magnus had flown from Singapore for the announcement. He was 81 and moving more slowly than he had the last time she'd seen him in person, but his eyes were the same. The quality of attention in them, the particular density of it, the way he looked at you like he was reading something you hadn't said yet. He'd embraced her in the hallway outside the boardroom before the announcement and held on longer than he usually held on, which was its own kind of communication. "You look like your mother," he said. He said it every time he saw her, and meant it every time, and every time it landed somewhere specific. "You always say that," she said into his shoulder. "It's always true," he said. The boardroom was full of people she mostly knew, executives she'd grown up watching operate, advisors who'd been part of the Vail structure since before she was born, 2 new faces who'd joined in the years of her absence, and who looked at her with the recalibrated attention of people encountering something they'd formed assumptions about and were now revising. She sat at the table and listened to the formal remarks and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the chair she was sitting in was the right shape, not comfortable, exactly. Right. After the announcement, after the photographs, after the professional small talk that was the required grammar of these occasions, she walked out of the Vail offices on Park Avenue and stood on the sidewalk in the March cold and let the city be around her for a minute without moving through it. She'd stood on this sidewalk 1,000 times. It looked the same and felt different, the way places feel different when you've changed enough to bring new eyes to them. A woman walked past with a child on her hip, talking on her phone, managing 3 things simultaneously with the absent expertise of someone for whom that particular balance had become second nature. A delivery cyclist cut through the intersection with practiced impatience. A man in a doorway was reading something on his phone with total absorption, the street noise apparent to him and irrelevant, ordinary. The city doing its ordinary things, the machine of it running on human energy and human necessity and the particular human stubbornness that refused to stop moving even when movement was hard. She'd loved this city before she'd understood what it would cost her. She still loved it. That felt important, that the cost hadn't changed what she'd felt before the cost. It had changed other things. It had changed her understanding of her own capacity for endurance and her understanding of how loneliness operates when it lives inside proximity to another person, and her understanding of what she owed herself in terms of witness, the specific obligation to see clearly what was happening to you while it was happening to you rather than afterward when the opportunity for response had passed. She'd failed that obligation for a while. She'd seen and chosen not to act, and she'd told herself she was waiting for more information when sometimes the information was complete, and she was just waiting for the courage to use it. She held that honestly. It was part of the account. Marcus appeared beside her. He'd been inside handling something and came out now with his coat half on, still working at the second button, and stood beside her on the sidewalk and looked at the street. "Ready?" he said. "For what?" she said. "I don't know. The next thing." She thought about that. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He finished his button. "Dad wants us for dinner Sunday. He's making the thing he makes." The fish thing. The fish thing. He won't tell anyone the recipe. He's been making it for 30 years and he still acts like someone's going to steal it. She smiled. A real one, not the composed professional expression she'd been wearing all morning. "Tell him yes. Tell him I'll bring wine. He'll say you don't need to." "I know." "Tell him anyway." The charitable foundation was Elena's idea, formed in the weeks after the board announcement and shaped over the following months into something with a structure she was proud of. Not proud in the way that required an audience, but proud in the private way that comes from building something that corresponds to your actual values rather than the values you've been assigned by circumstances. She called it the Celeste Vale Foundation after her mother. She didn't make a public statement about the name. If people asked, she told them, it's after my mother, who believed that the most important things didn't announce themselves. Most people who heard that nodded like they understood it. A few people who heard it understood it in the way she meant it, which was enough. The foundation's primary focus was literacy, not as its only area, but as its anchor. Programs in 5 boroughs, community centers and library partnerships, and the specific, unglamorous infrastructure of adult education that operated on inadequate funding in spaces that needed renovation and with instructors who were paid a fraction of what they were worth. She knew that world. She'd been in it for 2 years on the other side of it, and she'd seen what it actually needed, which was not a celebrity endorsement or a gala, but consistent funding and operational support and the kind of sustained institutional attention that didn't evaporate after the press release. She hired people who knew the work and gave them resources and stayed out of their way, except when they needed something she could provide, which was the management philosophy her father had used with her and which she'd only recently understood was a form of respect. On a Thursday in April, she went back to the literacy center in the village. She hadn't been there since before the gala. 6 months, nearly. And she went without announcement, just showed up in the afternoon the way she used to, in ordinary clothes with her green coat, and the coordinator at the front desk looked up, and her face did something complicated for a moment, and then she said, "You're back." "I'm back," Elena said, "if that's okay." "The Thursday group is in about an hour," the coordinator said. "Darnell's still coming." Elena sat in the small waiting area and felt the specific quality of the place. The fluorescent light and the laminate tables and the motivational posters that were slightly too earnest to be ironic and were not trying to be ironic. And she felt the rightness of it the same way she'd felt the rightness of the boardroom chair. Different kinds of rightness, both real. Darnell came in at 6:15. He was wearing his usual jacket and he moved with the careful dignity she remembered, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at her for a moment. "Elena," he said. "Hi, Darnell." He sat down across from her at the table and set his materials out with the methodical care he always brought to this, and then he looked at her directly with the directness of a man who had not had an easy life and had learned that straight was usually better than sideways. "I saw you on the news," he said. "I know," she said. "You didn't tell us." "No, I didn't." He nodded slowly, considering this. "You were just Elena when you were here," he said. Not accusing, observing. "Yes," she said. "That's what I was trying to be." He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. "Didn't work out exactly like you planned," he said. She felt the laugh before she expected it, a real one, sudden and unguarded. "No," she said. "Not exactly." He smiled then, a full one, which she'd seen before but not often. "Well," he said, "I've been working on something, while you were gone." He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a paragraph, handwritten, in the careful block letters of someone who had learned script late and was still negotiating the territory between precision and fluency. She read it. It was about his grandmother, about a house she'd had in Georgia with a garden and the smell of it in July, and the way she'd sit on the back steps in the evening and watch the light go. It was specific and honest, and it ended with a sentence that said, "She never learned to read either, but she knew things that books couldn't put in you." Elena read it twice. She felt something in the back of her throat that she recognized and didn't try to suppress. "Darnell," she said, "It's rough," he said. "I know the spelling is..." "It's not rough," she said. "It's good. It's genuinely good." He looked at the paper and then back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd seen that night he'd finished the paragraph. The private, personal thing that wasn't quite pride but lived near it, the recognition of something accomplished that no one could take back. "I figured I'd keep coming," he said, "even while you were gone." "I'm glad you did," she said. They worked for 2 hours. The rest of the group came in and the room filled up and she moved between the tables the way she always had, helping with the parts that needed help and leaving alone the parts that didn't. And the fluorescent light hummed and the city did its thing outside the windows, and nothing in the room required her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. She walked home that night. It was April and the evening was cold but not brutal, the specific cold of a season that was deciding to change, and she walked the 20 blocks from the literacy center to the Upper West Side with her hands in her coat pockets and the street around her doing its ordinary evening things. She thought about Luca once. Not at length, not with sustained focus, but once, a moment, brief and contained. She thought about him sitting in the dark penthouse after Danny left, alone in the apartment with the city's light coming through 43 floors of glass, and she held the image not with triumph and not with grief, but with the kind of clear-eyed recognition she'd been working toward for a long time. He'd made his choices. She'd made hers. The choices had consequences that were playing out in both their lives, with the impersonal exactness that consequences always have. She hoped, with the measured and genuine hope of someone who has moved past wanting anything specific from a person, that he found his way to something worth having on the other side of the wreckage. Not because he deserved it, because hoping otherwise would make her someone she didn't want to be. She turned onto her street. The building was ahead, its windows lit from inside in the irregular pattern of an occupied space where different people were home at different times, living their different lives in their separate rectangles of light. She stopped in front of it for a moment and looked up. She'd been living here for 5 months. She was going to live here for a while longer, and then she was going to find a place that was hers in the permanent way. Bought, not maintained by the company, not transitional, a place that corresponded to the life she was actually building rather than the life she'd been waiting to start. She'd been looking at neighborhoods. She liked this one. She liked Brooklyn. She liked the idea of a garden, which she'd never had, which her mother had loved. There was time. For the first time in a long time there was time, and it was hers, and she understood what to do with it. She went inside. She made tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the window open a crack and the sounds of the city coming through it, and she opened the folder Marcus had sent her about the Foundation's new Brooklyn program. 3 community centers, 2 library partnerships, funding secured for 18 months, staff being hired now. She read through the materials with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered, making notes in the margin in the handwriting that her father said looked like her mother's. The city breathed outside. The tea went warm and then cooler. Somewhere on the street below, someone was laughing. A real laugh. The sudden kind. The kind that happens when something is genuinely funny at an unexpected moment. She listened to it until it faded. Then she turned the page and kept reading. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not a single dramatic reversal, not a trial or a courtroom scene, or a moment where justice announced itself with the satisfying clarity of a verdict. Just the slow, unglamorous accumulation of choices made after the storm. The board meetings and the foundation work, and the Thursday evenings at the literacy center, and the calls with her father on Sunday, and the apartment she was going to buy with a garden, and the life she was assembling piece by piece from materials she'd chosen herself. Real power, she had come to understand, was not the power that cleared the room when you entered it. It was the power that remained when the room was empty. The capacity to build something worth building with the time you actually had, without requiring anyone to watch, without needing the watching to make it real. She'd known that, in the abstract for a long time. She knew it differently now, in the body, in the bone, in the specific weight of a coffee mug on a windowsill and a paragraph about a grandmother's garden and a city that kept going and a life that was, finally and fully and without apology, her own.